I don't speak very much Spanish, so I have the pleasure of being translated today by Jesus, who has the unfortunate pleasure of, while I've given this talk 12 times, this will be his first time translating it. So please give him a round of applause, because without him I don't think this would be successful.
Bueno, Brandon no habla mucho español, entonces yo voy a estar ayudando con la traducción y pues bueno, escuchemos su...
As he said, my name, soy Brandon Savage. I live in the United States in a place called Maryland. It's outside of Washington, D.C. And I'm here today to discuss with you the 7 deadly sins of object orientation. How many of you are PHP developers?
¿Cuántos de ustedes desarrollan en PHP?
Okay, most of you are. How many of you develop in something else?
¿En algo más?
Okay. So for those of you who are not PHP developers, all of the code samples are in PHP, but the principles should apply to your language as well. And it looks like many, if not most of you, do at least one or more language, which is great.
Todos los ejemplos están en PHP, pero son fáciles de entender y se ve que la mayoría de ustedes codifican en un lenguaje además de PHP, lo que les va a facilitar entender los ejemplos.
Before I get started, a little bit about who I am. I used to work for Mozilla, and now I run a company called Tailwinds, which does training and software development.
Brandon trabaja para Mozilla y ahora es el propietario de una compañía llamada Tailwinds, que hace, desarrolla software.
I've written a couple of books, and I also fly small airplanes for fun. In fact, this is my airplane back in Maryland.
He escrito unos pocos libros y también soy piloto de aviones. Este es mi avión en Maryland.
This is not how I got here.
No llegué así. No llegué en esto.
If you want to get in touch with me, feel free to tweet at me, send me an email. My website is there. If you need help, if you can't write in English, feel free to ask Luis for a little bit of assistance. If you have questions after the talk, I'm more than happy and more than excited to talk with you and share with you and answer any questions that you have.
Estaré más que feliz de responder a cualquier pregunta. Aquí están mis datos de contacto. Pueden preguntar a Luis si tienen problemas si tienen dificultades en escribir en inglés para que les ayude, pero estoy feliz de responder cualquiera de sus preguntas.
So today we're going to talk about what I call the 7 deadly sins of object-oriented programming. And these are what I think the 7 deadly sins of object-oriented programming are.
Pues vamos a hablar hoy de los 7 pecados capitales del diseño orientado a objetos, y estos son los que creo que son los 7 peores pecados del diseño orientado a objetos.
We'll go through each one individually, and so we'll start obviously with tight coupling, which we'll talk about now. Who knows what tight coupling is?
¿Quién sabe lo que es el emparejado fuerte? Acoplamiento fuerte.
So I was actually looking for show of hands.
Sí, es la pregunta. ¿Quién sabe qué es o tiene algún trato con esto de emparejar? Acoplamiento fuerte en programación de objetos.
Okay, so the concept of tight coupling is an idea where you have objects, and when they're tightly coupled together, each object needs all the other objects in order to function. You can't take one object and separate it from the others.
El acoplamiento fuerte es cuando tienes los objetos fuertemente ligados y no puedes utilizar un objeto sin utilizar objetos que los circundan o están fuertemente acoplados a él.
In object-oriented programming, what we're looking for is we want to be able to loosely couple our objects. We want them to be loosely related to one another so that we can form libraries, so that we can reuse objects, and to make things like testing and dependency management easier.
Para hacer más fácil el testing y el manejo de dependencias en la programación de objetos, lo ideal es tener los objetos desligados, lo más desligados posibles, no fuertemente acoplados.
To me, there are three kinds of tight coupling that happen regularly in object-oriented applications.
Hay tres tipos de acoplamiento fuerte en programación de objetos.
The first one is developers like to tie their code to a particular class name. And so here we have two examples, both in PHP. The first one, we're instantiating an object, and we're tied now to a class called other class. And the other one, we're using a static call, but we're still tied to the class name.
Uno de los problemas es cuando tienes un objeto fuertemente ligado a un espacio de nombres. Aquí hay un ejemplo donde está un objeto que está fuertemente ligado a su espacio de nombres porque está haciendo una llamada estática a una clase que no es la clase misma. Lo pueden ver es my class y abajo dice some third class, que es una llamada estática con doble punto a una clase que no está dentro de ese namespace. Entonces están haciendo un acoplamiento muy fuerte.
I got most of that, actually. The goal is we want to tie our code to objects, not to classes. And the reason that we want to do this is because this is object-oriented programming, not class-oriented programming. It seems easy to tie code to a class or to a class name, but what we're really focused and what we're really trying to accomplish here is ensuring that the code is tied to objects and that we are using objects rather than classes.
El objetivo es ligar los objetos el código a los objetos en lugar de ligarlo a la clase. Es lo más recomendable, ligar el código a los objetos y no a la clase.
Porque es programación orientada a objetos, no programación orientada a clases.
I would have said the same thing. The second kind of tight coupling is too many dependencies. When you have an object that has so many things you're giving to it that it makes testing nearly impossible because of all the things you have to mock or stub or recreate or reconfigure just in order to write tests.
El segundo tipo de acoplamiento fuerte es tener demasiadas dependencias. Es muy difícil testar y mantener un código por todas las cosas que tienes que configurar para hacerlo correr teniendo muchas dependencias.
There's a reason that it's called dependency injection, which is that we are injecting all of these dependencies into an object. And the more dependencies we have, the more tightly coupled together the object is to all the other objects.
Hay una razón por la cual se llama inyección de dependencias, porque estamos inyectando muchas dependencias a un objeto, de forma que este objeto se vuelve dependiente de todas esas dependencias.
Now, there are some ways that you can combat this. One of them is called the mediator pattern, and the way the mediator pattern works is it assigns one object the job of being the place where all the dependencies go. The idea here is that if you have an object whose job it is to manage these dependencies, you can then use the other objects individually, and it makes testing far easier because you're now able to test those objects individually.
Hay un patrón que se llama el patrón de mediación, en donde aíslas los objetos de las dependencias y uno de ellos es el que maneja las dependencias para que puedas probar y mantener cada objeto o cada clase individualmente.
Another option is to use something called service location or service factories. By a show of hands, who uses Laravel?
¿Quién usa Laravel? Pueden levantar sus manos.
Just two people? I'm really surprised. I would have imagined more people used it, but okay. Laravel is one of the frameworks that makes heavy use of something called service location. The idea behind service location is that you have some service that you have given to a factory, and that factory is responsible for knowing that service and then on request providing that service. So you don't have to inject all the dependencies, rather you inject the factory and ask for the dependencies you actually need.
Laravel PHP es uno de los frameworks que utilizan más esta técnica que se llama localización de servicios, en la cual tienes una fábrica de servicios y es a la que le pides las dependencias en lugar de inyectárselas directamente al objeto.
Now, it's entirely possible that you're still looking at your code and thinking to yourself, is it too complicated? And there does come a time when your dependencies are indicative of having a lot of complex code that you just need to take out and remove. So it's always worthwhile asking yourself, is the code that I'm working with too complicated? Should I make this simpler? And a lot of times that will help, that will solve the problem, that will work.
Una de las formas de resolver el problema es preguntarte si tu código es muy complejo, y vale mucho la pena que te lo preguntes, porque esa es una de las formas en que puedes mejorar.
Luis, did you grab me a bottle of water? Thank you. Talking in front of a group of people is one way to end up with dry mouth. Now I know you didn't tell them the whole joke. You just told them to laugh, didn't you?
Hablaba sobre mí, de hecho.
Un momento. That'll work. The third kind of tight coupling is this idea of exposing the internals of an object to the outside world. And by internals, I mean methods you don't want the outside world to know or to use.
El tercer tipo de acoplado fuerte es exponer las cosas internas del método, es decir, los métodos que no quieres que use el mundo exterior y que sin embargo expones.
In this code example, if you're assuming that the prepare method is an internal method that's not meant to be used by anything other than the object, and yet you mark it as public, or in other languages, Python, I believe it's a couple of underscores that make it, at least by convention, protected or private. If you tell the world this method is available, someone's going to use it.
Si tú expones o marcas como público un método que no estás preparado para ser público, alguien lo va a utilizar. En Python, aquí dijo un ejemplo de Python donde se usa el guión bajo para marcar los métodos como privados. Si no pones esas marcas, si no pones tus convenciones y si no marcas los métodos como privados cuando deben ser privados, alguien los va a usar. Este es el tercer tipo de acoplamiento.
You want to make sure that you're only exposing the methods that you actually need in order for other objects to work with your object. And then everything else that you don't need, mark protected or private either by convention or by visibility if it's available to you in your language of choice.
Debes marcar como privados los métodos que necesitan ser privados. Si el método no necesita ser utilizado por el mundo externo, no debes hacerlo. O seguir las convenciones en los lenguajes que no tienen marcas private, como Python.
Any questions?
¿Preguntas?
Bien.
Yes, I want one. Could you give me your presentation more later?
I'm sorry?
But could you give me your presentation more later?
You want the slides?
Ah,
Absolutely.
okay.
I'm going to give the slides to Luis, and he'll send them out to whoever wants them to look at and follow along. And feel free if you want, if you're really enthusiastic, translate them into Spanish. That's okay with me.
Pueden utilizar mis slides, los va a tener Luis para quien quiera que las necesite.
¿Tienes preguntas?
Traducir. Those multiple inheritance involves tight coupling.
Multiple inheritance is tough. There are only a few languages that support it. PHP isn't one of them, so I haven't had a lot of experience with it. That said, inheritance is really kind of its own ball game, and I'm actually about to talk about inheritance, and I'll try and tie in multiple inheritance to that as I talk about it.
La herencia múltiple tiene sus propias dificultades, es algo muy difícil, no muchos lenguajes lo soportan, PHP no lo soporta, pero vamos a hablar sobre herencia más adelante.
¿Preguntas?
Más bien.
Bien. Okay, so the second deadly sin is extending the interface. This happens a lot. You have a class that someone defines, and then they extend that class and they add a new method. And then in some other object where they use the object they've defined, they type int on base class, parent, but they expect the method from the child.
Aquí hay otro, ¿qué está mal en este código? Hay una clase que alguien define y luego la extienden y luego alguien más utiliza un método de una clase que extiende de una subclase pero llama a, bueno, que extiende de una clase padre pero llama al método de la clase que extiende de esa clase padre, como se puede ver aquí.
The problem here is that this is going to fail in just about every language I know of. Because if I pass in an instance of the parent, it'll pass the type hint. But if once I get to the call to the method that doesn't exist because I pass it the parent, not the child, it'll fail.
Lo que está mal aquí va a fallar en casi todos los lenguajes que conozco, porque aún si pasa el filtro de los tipos, no va a pasar el filtro de que el método no existe en esa clase.
What this means is that in this case, I'm actually relying on the implementation, not the type of the object. Even though I'm doing a type hint, I'm actually not verifying the type and I'm not enforcing the type. I'm relying on the implementation.
Estoy dependiendo de la implementación y no del tipo.
Now there's a principle in object-oriented development called the Liskov substitution principle, which says that subtypes should be identical to their parents. In other words, if I have an object of type A, and I have a child of that object, which is object O, I should be able to substitute O for A in all cases, and have the program still work.
El principio de sustitución de Liskov dice que los subtipos deben ser idénticos a sus pares. Si yo tengo un subtipo A que hereda de un subtipo O que hereda de un tipo A, debo poder cambiar, tener libertad de cambiar entre esos dos tipos sin tener ese tipo de problema.
And the problem here is that we mentioned instances of base class, my class, are going to fail because we're using a method that it doesn't have. So I see three ways to fix this.
Hay tres formas de resolver este problema.
The first option is to mark my class as abstract and include the abstract method. And this works well in PHP. Other languages that don't have abstract as an option could throw an exception for the method or something along those lines. But the way this would look in PHP is we define our abstract base class, we include the abstract method, and then when we extend it, we define the method, and now the base class has the method in it, its signature in it, and this will work.
Una forma de arreglar esto es marcar la clase como abstracta e incluir el método abstracto en ella. En PHP se puede esto, en algunos otros lenguajes no tienen clases abstractas, pero bueno, así es como se vería en PHP, incluyendo el método y la clase abstracta, y así la firma del método va a estar presente en el tipo.
Our second option is to type in on the object we're actually using. We might actually intend to extend the functionality and create a new object type. That would be perfectly fine, but we have to change the type hint if that's the case. If we change the type hint and now we have my other class as the type hint, this will, again, it'll work. And what we're saying here is we're saying I am actually defining a new type of object by extending the interface.
De otra forma es incluir una pista del tipo en la clase, de forma que se pueda dar cuenta el implementador que está utilizando un método que no existe en la clase.
Our third option, and this is pretty PHP specific because this requires a feature of PHP, is to define two distinct interfaces and then type in on the right one. I mentioned this as an option. I don't recommend this as the best option, but you can do this. And the way this would look is something like this, where anytime that we are passing in, we type in on the interface we want, and we leave the implementation details up to someone else.
Otra forma es hacer dos interfaces e incluir la pista del tipo en una de ellas y heredárselo de una de ellas, de forma que alguien más pueda utilizar el código.
So those are the three options we have in this case. The important thing to remember is that objects know each other by their interfaces, and by interfaces I mean the public methods that are available. So if you've marked methods as protected or private or internal, those methods are not part of the interface. Those methods are not part of the behavior. Those methods can change, those methods will change, they can go away, they can come back. But objects expect that when they deal with another object, that the public methods that are available to them are going to be the methods that they're going to use. And this interface then in turn defines the type of the object, because type is defined by behavior. And so an object that behaves a certain way is of a certain type. I think in Python it's called duck typing, actually. There's a name for it. So it's important to recognize that just because something will pass a type hint doesn't necessarily mean that it will work in your application. And good luck with that.
El comportamiento de los objetos define el tipo de los objetos. Y no necesariamente porque un objeto sea de un tipo significa que ese objeto va a funcionar en tu aplicación. Los objetos se conocen a sí mismos por sus interfaces y las interfaces definen su tipo. Más o menos resumido.
¿Preguntas?
¿Alguna pregunta en esto?
Maybe we can try shorter sentences.
How much shorter?
Or just making a pause.
Sorry?
Just making a pause.
Okay, the third sin that I see often is this idea where you have one class that has many responsibilities.
Una clase que tiene muchas responsabilidades es la tercera medida.
How many responsibilities can you see in this code?
¿Cuántas responsabilidades pueden ver en este código?
I hear one as an option. Any other guesses?
Actually, two, because we have the validation. We also have the fetching. We have already a connection to a database. We have well, for this specific type of code, we see around 4 functions that are part of it, or part of the class, and that's way too much.
So this one method has 5 responsibilities.
Este método tiene 5 responsabilidades.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I could do that one. The problem here is that we're breaking the single responsibility principle, which says that each class, or each object should have a single job.
El problema aquí es que estamos rompiendo el principio de una responsabilidad que dice que cada objeto debe tener un solo trabajo.
So what we want to do is we want to reduce the responsibilities because we're dealing with the global scope, dealing with the connection, actually getting the data from the database, validating it, and then doing what we created the object to do in the first place.
El problema es que estamos haciendo las conexiones a la base de datos, haciendo la autenticación, buscando al usuario, y al final hacemos lo único que tiene que hacer este método.
I hope that translated well.
Sí, y al final pues solamente va a ser lo que al inicio queríamos hacer, ¿no? Que era autenticar.
So let's go ahead and refactor, and I'm going to do it on the slide because, I suck at coding live.
Vamos a recodificar.
So the first thing I'm going to do is eliminate the global scope calls that we had in the PHP code.
Lo primero que vamos a hacer es eliminar las llamadas al ámbito global de este código.
Instead, I'm going to use a context object that contains my post, get, and other data in it. so that I have an object for that and I can test that object later.
Lo primero que vamos a hacer es hacer un objeto que va a tener el contexto para esas llamadas al ámbito global y vamos a utilizar ese objeto en este método.
Okay, so that responsibility is somewhere else. The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of this SQL code and replace it with a model.
Ahora vamos a quitar todo el código SQL y reemplazarlo con un módulo.
The idea here is that this is model view controller, and in the old way we had the model and the controller in the same object. So now they're in different objects.
Esto es MVC, modelo vista controlador, y aquí tenemos una llamada al modelo, haciendo estos dos, repartiendo la responsabilidad en dos partes, en el modelo y en el controlador.
So I'm done, right? How many people think I'm finished here?
¿Cuántas personas piensan que ya terminé aquí con esta refactorización de este código?
The fact is that I still have some problems. Even though I removed a responsibility, I added a new one, because the new keyword is a responsibility in and of itself. Creating objects is a responsibility in and of itself.
El problema es que he añadido una nueva responsabilidad quitando uno. La palabra new, o la palabra reservada new, indica una nueva responsabilidad en este código.
Of course, objects don't just come to exist. So we have to create them somewhere. So there are some strategies we can use for creating objects that will help reduce the number of responsibilities in this code.
Hay estrategias para crear objetos, para ayudar a reducir las responsabilidades en este objeto. Hay varias formas de crear objetos y vamos a ver estas estrategias.
Two options available to us are dependency injection or factories.
Dos opciones disponibles para nosotros son las fábricas o los factories y la inyección de dependencias.
In this case, I'm going to use a little bit of both by injecting a factory and then using that factory to create the user object and thus removing that responsibility from my code.
En este código voy a usar un poco de ambas, usando una fábrica, un factory, para inyectar la dependencia en este objeto y reducir la responsabilidad.
Now I'm finished because the context is a responsibility of another object, the model is a responsibility of another object, and the only thing that I have to worry about doing is either returning login or wrong password.
He terminado porque el modelo es responsabilidad de alguien más, el contexto global ya es responsabilidad de alguien más y lo único que tengo que hacer es la autenticación.
Now there is an exception to the rule about creating objects. And the exception to the rule is that you want to create objects when you're only going to use them internally. For example, when you create a string in Python, you create a new object. I don't expect you to pass in your strings, okay, because that string is going to be used locally. And in the same sense, I don't inject my paginators into my classes because that would just be silly. Sorry.
Hay un problema con la creación de objetos también, porque hay objetos que solo se pueden usar, que solo deben usarse internamente. Por ejemplo, cuando se crea un string en Python, se crea un nuevo objeto. Y pues no hay necesidad de inyectar un paginador como ejemplo en un query.
Any questions about this so far? Bien. Number 4, overusing static methods, and this is PHP specific.
Número 4, el uso excesivo de métodos estáticos, aunque esto es PHP estático. Digo, específico de PHP.
This is some Laravel code that I took out of a project that I was working on.
Este es un pedazo de código que tomé de un proyecto en el que estaba trabajando.
There are 4 static method calls here.
Hay 4 llamadas estáticas aquí.
Now, a Laravel developer will tell you it's object-oriented under the hood, and he makes a good point because this is actually what's going on if you look at the PHP code.
Lo que un desarrollador Laravel te diría es que esto es desarrollo orientado a objetos debajo del mantel. Aquí está lo que pasa en realidad.
The problem is you're still tied to the class name, and we talked about this in number 1 with tight coupling, being tied to the class name. When you're tied to the class name, it's just like using the new keyword, and it breaks a whole bunch of different rules that you want to avoid.
El problema es que sigues demasiado ligado a la clase, esto lo vimos anteriormente, y las llamadas estáticas te ligan mucho a una clase, a un nombre de una clase, de la misma forma que la palabra reservada new.
Static methods are often used as part of what's known as service location. And that's exactly what we're doing here in the Laravel code, is service location.
Exactamente lo que estamos haciendo aquí es localización de servicios. Los métodos estáticos te llevan a localización de servicios.
Service location has its values. I use it from time to time myself, but the important thing to remember is that service location is not dependency inversion.
La localización de servicios no es inversión de dependencias.
Dependency inversion is an object-oriented principle which tells us that we should rely on abstractions rather than concrete functional bits of code as our model.
La inversión de dependencias es un patrón que nos dice que debemos confiar en las clases abstractas en lugar de objetos concretos.
My general rule of thumb is that I only use statics when testing the static doesn't really matter. For example, when I have a logger, I will use statics with the logger because I don't need to test this.
La única vez en donde se deben utilizar llamadas estáticas es donde, bueno, por ejemplo aquí, cuando hay una llamada logger que no necesita ser probada, no necesita ser testeada.
I'm always going to end up mocking the log handler when I actually go to write my tests.
Porque siempre vas a utilizar el mismo manejador de log.
At the end of the day, there's almost always a better way to do something than to use statics. So ask yourself if there is, and if there is, do it.
Pregúntate a ti mismo al final del día si hay una forma mejor que llamadas estáticas, y si hay una forma mejor, hazlo.
Number 5, what I like to call overbearing interfaces.
Número 5, lo que yo llamo sobrecarga de interfaces.
Most of us, at least PHP developers, have written a framework of our own. Seems to be a rite of passage for most people who do PHP. And we almost always write a database object that looks something like this.
La mayor parte de los que no utilizamos un framework PHP terminamos escribiendo un objeto, una interfaz a la base de datos, muchas veces como esta.
The problem is that not all databases support transactions. There are types of MySQL databases that don't support transactions. For a long time, SQLite didn't support transactions. Not all databases are ACID compliant.
No todas las bases de datos soportan transacciones. Hay bases de datos SQL que no soportan transacciones y bases de datos no SQL que tampoco soportan transacciones.
What ends up happening here is that if we don't support transactions, we're going to have empty transaction methods. And this breaks the interface segregation principle, which says that you're not supposed to require objects to implement methods that they don't use.
El problema es que hay algunas interfaces de bases de datos que van a terminar teniendo métodos vacíos para estos métodos, para estas, estas conexiones a la base de datos, y esto va a romper el principio de segregación que dice que no debes forzar a los objetos a implementar métodos que no van a utilizar.
If we want to follow the interface segregation principle, a better database interface would look something like this, and would break the transaction-aware methods out on their own, so that if we need them, we can use them, and if we don't need them, we don't have to use them.
La forma de arreglar esto es romper la implementación de la clase de la interfaz en dos diferentes, de forma que haya una interfaz que aísle estos métodos para las transacciones, y cuando no necesitemos una interfaz de base de datos que soporte transacciones, podamos heredar directamente de la clase que no las necesita y no forcemos a los objetos a implementar estos métodos.
The idea here is that if you require transactions, you can use them, but if you don't need them. Now, I don't necessarily recommend creating a database interface this way, but it's an example. It's an example of perfect. It's an example of what would be perfect if we were to do it. In the real world, you probably wouldn't do it this way, but it's an example.
Esto es un ejemplo. En el mundo real realmente tal vez no lo hagas así, pero es un ejemplo de cómo debería hacerse, de cómo sería perfecto.
Something else to watch out for is the God object. And what the God object looks like is something like this.
Algo más que vigilar es el objeto Dios, y el objeto Dios sería algo como esto.
This is the interface for something in PHP known as Imagic.
Esa es la interfaz para algo, una librería en PHP llamada Imagic.
And this is more of that interface.
Y esto es más de esa interfaz.
And more of that interface.
Más.
And at this point, I think I've made my point.
Y en este punto creo que ya me entendieron.
Small interfaces are really, really good. You could never fully test the Imagic interface. And don't even think about implementing it in a different way, because there are actually something like 63 slides of that interface, but we don't have that kind of time.
Las pequeñas interfaces son mejores. No se espera que, más bien es imposible testear o probar la librería de Imagic o la interfaz de Imagic, y de hecho hay como 63 slides o 63 diapositivas más del código que viene.
¿Preguntas? Okay. Number 6, actually failing to object-orient your code.
Número 6. Fallar en diseñar tu código orientado a objetos.
Some of these are somewhat PHP specific, but they apply as well to other languages. Globals have no place in object-oriented code.
Dije que esto es de PHP, pero funciona en cualquier otro lenguaje. Los globales o las variables globales no tienen lugar en el código orientado a objetos.
This was very common a long time ago in PHP. Don't do this anymore. A better way is to replace the globals with a context object, like we talked about a little bit earlier. And the idea here is that the context object is an object, and we can use this object in a number of ways.
La forma de reemplazar los globales es usar un objeto de contexto. Lo que vieron en el estudio anterior era como se hacía antiguamente en PHP, pero la forma en que debe hacerse es teniendo un objeto de contexto y así utilizar el objeto del contexto en el contexto directamente.
The advantage of doing this is that I can actually test this. I can write a unit test for this. This, in fact, is a unit test for this that asserts that what I get is what I expect.
Lo mejor de esto es que es probable, con que puedes testear. Este es de hecho un unit test o una unidad de testing para el código que viene.
This next one doesn't really apply to like Python or other object-oriented languages. It more applies to procedural languages that have an object model, which is when you're using a procedural library, develop an object so that you can use it in your object-oriented applications.
Cuando utilicen una librería en código procedural, hagan un objeto para utilizar las capacidades de esa librería en su código orientado a objetos.
A long time ago, the way that you would go about doing file uploads would look something like this in PHP.
Hace algún tiempo la forma en que utilizarían, la forma en que subirían archivos en PHP se vería de esta forma.
Now, with object-oriented PHP, the idea would be to pass in some kind of uploading object to handle this process for us.
Ahora, en el PHP orientado a objetos, lo ideal es pasar un objeto que haga esto en lugar de hacerlo nosotros mismos.
The advantage here is that we can mock the file system. In addition, we can use other sources of storage and files, like Amazon or other things, that we can replace the components with on the back end.
La ventaja de esto es que podemos librarnos del sistema de archivos y de hecho podemos utilizar cualquier otro tipo de llamadas a archivos o llamadas de lidiar con archivos.
In addition, I like to write as little code as possible. I like to use Composer, or if I'm doing Python, I like to use pip or gems or whatever it is that your package manager is. Use the packages that are available to you. Don't reinvent the wheel.
No reinventen la rueda, utilicen los paquetes ya desarrollados, ya sea en Ruby con los gems.
Los manejadores de paquetes ya desarrollados, como puede ser pip en Python, como puede ser Composer en PHP, o etcétera, ¿no?
This is the default file that I use for my projects in PHP. I have one for pip as well when I do Python work, but this is a PHP talk, this is the PHP one. All of these packages do great things. They deal with web requests, they deal with uploads, they deal with pagination, they deal with escaping, they deal with logging.
Este es mi archivo de dependencias para PHP hecho con Composer. También tengo archivos hechos en pip porque también hago Python. Este archivo define cuáles librerías se van a encargar de todas estas tareas. Conexiones web, conexiones a base de datos, sesiones y web, logs y vistas, etc.
Now I know you didn't translate that perfectly, exactly.
Bueno, se refiere que el manejador de dependencias ya hace automáticamente la parte de HTTP y autenticación, etc.
It's important to remember that just because you've wrapped some procedural code in a class doesn't make it object-oriented. This goes for every language. I have seen some of the worst procedural code in Python ever. Python is object-oriented, and yet I've seen terrible procedural code in Python. PHP is procedural, and yet I've seen great object-oriented code in PHP. Just because you wrap procedural code in a class doesn't make it object-oriented.
Recuerden que si escriben código procedural envuelto o con un wrapper en una clase, no lo hace orientado a objetos. Por ejemplo, en Python he visto código de lo peor, y eso que Python es orientado a objetos, mientras que en PHP, que es procedural, he visto el mejor código orientado a objetos.
Now that I think about it, I probably wrote some of that bad procedural code in Python. Last but not least, over abstraction.
Al final, pero no menos importante, sobre abstracción.
I like that way of saying last but not least. Last but not less important. You don't want to be this guy that calls a property and then calls a bunch of methods, which changes objects in the middle, and pretty much nobody has any idea what this object is doing at all.
No quieres ser ese tipo que está llamando un objeto y luego otro objeto y luego otro objeto y nadie tiene idea de lo que este código realmente hace.
Abstraction is a core component of object-oriented development, but it's really important not to go overboard with your abstractions.
La abstracción es lo principal en el diseño orientado a objetos, pero tienes que ser cuidadoso de no sobrepasarte con la abstracción.
Any Java developers in the room?
¿Algún developer Java aquí?
Okay, a couple. The Java developers know well the factory for the factory that makes the factory.
Los desarrolladores Java saben bastante bien de una fábrica, un factory que llama otro y otro y otro.
Don't do that. That's not what we're going for here. We want to actually get something done.
No hagan eso.
Abstraction and liquor are really good in moderation, but too much and bad things happen.
La abstracción y el licor son muy buenos en moderación, pero muy malos en exceso.
Bad things like getting fired from your job because you spent all of your time writing a new framework for something instead of actually doing the work you were supposed to do.
Pueden despedirte de tu trabajo por gastar mucho tiempo en tu framework haciendo sobre abstracción y en realidad no teniendo el trabajo hecho.
You want to make sure you strike a balance between writing code that follows all the best object-oriented principles and code that makes sense, code that you can read, code that you can understand, and code that you can work with.
Debemos hacer códigos que puedan entender, que puedan trabajar y tener un balance entre sólido y sencillo.
The truth is, and this is more for the PHP people in the room, you're probably not writing your own framework. That's probably not what your boss is paying you to do. Now, every time I say that, someone raises their hand and everyone says, well, yeah, I work on a framework. Great for you. Don't listen to this bit. But if you aren't writing a framework, you don't have to abstract everything out in the most perfect way that can be extended in a million different ways by a million different people, because there's a good chance that you and your coworkers are the only people who are ever going to ever work with this code.
Probablemente no están haciendo su propio framework, pero cada vez que digo esto, alguien levanta su mano y dice, yo estoy haciendo mi propio framework. Y bien por ustedes, pero no tiene que sobreabstraer su framework de forma que se pueda implementar de 1.000.000 de formas, de forma que se puedan extender clases de 1.000.000 de formas, porque probablemente los únicos que trabajen al final con su framework sean ustedes y su compañero.
And the bottom line is, just because you can abstract something out doesn't mean that you necessarily should.
Solo porque puedes abstraer algo no significa que debes abstraer.
I've written a book about object-oriented PHP that I invite you to take a look at if you're a PHP developer who's learning object-oriented PHP. Luis, I believe, has read it and taken my class. He can vouch for me personally. But feel free, you can get a discount with Brandon's Best. You take some money off of it, and it's available. So I'll send these slides if you don't get a chance to write this down. It won't really apply to other languages, but PHP developers or people who want to learn PHP, this will really help you with your object-oriented PHP.
He escrito algunos libros en PHP, este es uno, se llama Mastering Object-Oriented PHP. Está disponible en el sitio web que pueden leer y tienen este código, Brandon Best, para tener el 10% de descuento. Se los recomiendo si son desarrolladores de PHP y quieren hacer su código orientado a objetos. Y las slides las tiene Luis para quien quiera requerirse.
That sales pitch sounds a lot better in Spanish. And with that, I'll open up preguntas. Don't worry, you're not done yet. If they got them, I'm... Sí.
There are ways to, is there any way or several ways to have some kind of practice to not to fail in these problems, or something like some kind of exercises or some way to practice this?
Are you asking me to pitch my class?
Yes, probably.
So there are a number of good ways. Ways that cost no money would be work with other people's code. The PHP League is really great. Aura PHP is really great. Many of the pip packages in Python are really great. Many of the gems are really great. Ruby on Rails, not so great. Django, not so great. But a lot of the packages are really well written. Read them, use them, work with them, see how they operate, learn how they operate. Should I pause so that you can translate that?
Bueno, lo que les pregunto es, ¿qué podemos hacer, qué podemos practicar para tener un código orientado a objetos mejor? Y bueno, nos dice Brandon que hay muchas gemas en Ruby, muchas librerías en Python, muchas librerías en PHP y las de Ruby no son tan buenas, dice Brandon. Pero lo mejor es ver el código de otras personas, utilizarlo, trabajar con él y ver cómo está hecho. Es la mejor forma.
Y hay otras maneras gratuitas de hacerlo, como el PHP League.
I don't know what he said.
There are some other ways to do it.
Yeah. Some other ways, so once you've read code, used code, most of these packages are open source. You can contribute back to them, and putting your code up for someone else to look at will be more than helpful to you for helping you to learn proper object-oriented things, as well as hacking on these as well.
Hay muchas librerías de este tipo que son open source, pueden contribuir a estos proyectos y que otras personas miren su código. Esta es una más que buena forma de probar su código, de hacerlo mejor, orientado a objetos y mejorar.
And then there are, of course, opportunities. I teach a class for PHP called Object-Oriented PHP Masterclass that I'll be teaching in November. There are conferences as well. I'm sure that there are Python and Ruby and Java classes that you can find if those are the languages of your choice. But for PHP, Object-Oriented PHP Masterclass is mine.
Hay muchos recursos y tienen otros lenguajes de su preferencia como Java, Ruby, etc. Hay recursos en la red, pero para PHP mi clase es una de las mejores, la clase que voy a dar en noviembre.
¿Otras preguntas? Sí.
La composición, bueno, el diseño de patrones de patrón que se llama composición de objetos, el acoplamiento fuerte es composición de objetos.
In software design, there is a pattern called object composition. Is this type coupling?
Yes and no. Every time you have an object dependent on another object, you have added coupling. Whether or not it's tight coupling is really up to you. The idea is to have as few objects dependent on one another as possible. I'll let you translate and I'll continue.
Sí, no. Cada vez que un objeto refiere a otro, lo liga, y si es acoplamiento fuerte o no, depende de ti. Y sí, eso.
At the end of the day, you have to make a decision, and every decision you make in software design is a trade-off, because every feature I add increases complexity, and if I never add features for simplicity, my app doesn't do anything.
Al final del día es un problema del código orientado a objetos. Cada vez que añades una característica para mejorar algo, es en realidad un intercambio. Añades más complejidad por una característica. Y si nunca añades características, en realidad puede que tu app no haga nada.
Does that answer your question?
¿Se respondió la pregunta?
¿Otras preguntas?
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Well, thank you all very much for having me here in Puebla. I've enjoyed my time here. Mexico is a beautiful country. That's my first visit, and I've really enjoyed myself. So thank you all for coming, and I wish you a wonderful weekend.
Muchas gracias por venir. Es mi primera vez en Puebla y en México. Considero que México es un país muy hermoso. Lo he disfrutado mucho.